New and improved methods to lie with statistics. People use statistics and mathematics to sell you things you don't need or may even actually be harmful. This is not new. It's part of the history of statistics. In fact, a lot of modern statistics was developed specifically to sell the idea of eugenics and eugenics policies, such as forced sterilization laws and other, discriminatory policies and so forth. A lot of the people in mostly the United Kingdom, like Ronald Fisher and Thomas Galton and Carl Pearson, many of the pioneers of modern statistics and mathematical modeling, which is used all over the world today, thanks to computers, actually were eugenics enthusiasts and even fanatics. And they use these methods improperly, in my opinion, to sell public policies that were quite questionable and are now anathema. Everybody looks down their nose at them, at least publicly. But in fact, we see the use of statistics and mathematical modeling to sell drugs like Vioxx, vaccines, all kinds of products, public policies, politicians. It's pervasive in our society. And people have realized that statistics is used in misleading ways for a long time, and there's an entire literature on this. For example, the famous book, How to Lie with Statistics by Darrell Huff from 1954, which illustrates, often with political examples, misleading methods that were used in the 1930s and 40s and 50s. I'm going to say a little bit about those historical methods, but what I want to talk to you about is new, improved, modern methods to fool people into doing things that aren't in their interest or maybe quite harmful. Computers have revolutionized mathematics and statistics and made it possible to lie with statistics and mathematical models in new and very difficult to prove or demonstrate ways compared to the past. So I'm going to talk about these methods and say a little bit about how we maybe can detect them and how some of the things that I'm working on might make this easier for all of us. I'm going to talk first about some of the particular historical method, which is very common and still in practice, of misleading people with statistics. Now, there are actually several methods, and as I said, there's a whole popular and semi-popular literature on these deceptive tactics, such as Darrell Huff's book. There's several books by Joel Best, whom I'll refer to in a moment as well, that are more recent and also discuss some of these methods. So there's a very simple technique that turns up over and over again in many public policy issues and I think also with products and so forth. And when you want to sell something, you usually start by selling a problem. Okay, you start with problem, solution. The solution is what you want people to buy. It can be something they pay for. Sometimes it's a public policy or voting for a politician. You sell the problem. You convince people there's a really serious problem. And that gets them to then actually buy the solution which you offer. You try to present that solution as the only possible solution to the alleged problem. So they'll come and run to you and buy whatever you're selling, which can be a drug, it can be a vaccine, it can be your car, it can be a lot of different things. The statistics is usually used in this context to create and support that there is really a big problem you should worry about. Now, the technique that is used is a very broad definition of the problem, and I'll give some examples of this, paired with a horror story, which may be a very rare, unusual case that really tugs at your emotions, frightens you, makes you angry, hits the emotion. And that's probably the most important part of these sales pitches, is to get to your emotions, to get you really frightened or greedy in some cases, but pairing it usually with a broad definition of the problem. So what's an example of this? Well, you might have heard, and I grew up with this, a number of 1 million missing children per year. Now, this was a widely quoted number in the early 1980s. Now, this was a period where there was a lot of concerns about serial killers, about child molestation, about stranger abduction and murder of children. And there were some very high profile, horrible cases in the news, like the abduction and murder of Adam Walsh, which is, John Walsh went on to become a crusader, a TV show, all that kind of stuff. That's the father of Adam Walsh. Now, it's worth considering the context here that there did appear to be a significant increase in the 1960s and 70s, peaking around the early 80s when these fears became the most widespread in so-called serial killer cases. Okay, they went up quite a lot. They were in the news. They were heavily promoted, partly because the FBI took an interest in them. And they've actually declined a lot. You don't hear about serial killers very much today. They seem to be much rarer. I've looked at the statistics. There appear to be many fewer cases. The thing you see today is often these mass shootings, which have surged for some reason in the last few years. Serial killers are a whole other discussion, but a significant subset of them involve the abduction and murder of children or teenagers, horrible cases. It is not improbable that Adam Walsh may have been killed in such a case. In fact, it's often blamed on a supposed serial killer Ottis Toole. So this was paired with exaggerated statistics produced by various people. One of those was the million missing children. How did they get a million missing children in the United States? And this was eventually the subject of a Pulitzer Prize-winning expose by the Denver Post. What they did is actually lots of kids, mostly teenagers, very heavily teenage girls, tend to go run off with a boyfriend in many cases and disappear for a while. And parents get freaked out, they call the cops. And that number is actually very large and was very large. Now, it also includes just miscommunication. Your kid goes off to do something, they thought they told you, all this kind of stuff. So most of these are short disappearances. They're sometimes very frightening, but mostly they end fine. And they're not like some stranger abducted the kid or anything like that. The stranger abduction cases and the more serious cases are a tiny subset of these missing children reports all over the country. They're not zero. And it's actually hard to this day to get a clear picture of these more serious cases. Okay, remarkably enough, despite all the hype in the 80s and worries about missing children and centers for missing and exploited children, it actually remains hard to have a clear picture of exactly what we're talking about. But it's small. And what I mean by small is maybe 1,000 children are murdered a year, for example, and some number disappear and are never found. So we're in that ballpark. It could be, the FBI at one point was claiming it was only 70 a year or something like that. That's maybe iffy. But nonetheless, it was nowhere near a million. And yet this number worked its way into the popular culture. It appears in movies. It even gets repeated today, despite being well debunked for the most part, that it was exaggerated. This is a very common trick. You have a horrifying story like the abduction and murder of Adam Walsh. And there were other murders like this at the time that got in the news and got a lot of coverage. You have a horrifying story of what is generally not representative of the problem. That is paired, and that's really what pushes people's emotional buttons. That is paired with grossly exaggerated statistics. Now, this isn't just something that happens with missing children. Serial killer cases, in a lot of these cases, declined over the 80s and dropped to actually fairly low levels of seemingly today. Again, because there's questions about what murders go unsolved and murders of children go unsolved, it's a little hard to know exactly what the real numbers are. So I don't want to discount, that some disappearances and murders of children are real and that we, should be concerned about some of these things, but not at the level that was promoted in the early 80s. It's not entirely clear why this decline. There was an overall general decline in murders, just as there had been an overall increase in murders in the 60s. It somewhat tracks executions. So executions had dropped to pretty close to zero per year, like 1 or 2 people a year in the late 60s, were completely suspended from 72 to 78 in that period. And were very low and went back up over the 80s to higher levels. And executions are probably a proxy also for tough on crime policies, more incarceration. So it's a good candidate for a major factor in why you see this surge in serial killers and surge in murders in the 60s and 70s, early 80s, and it drops back down. That's a controversial position, but it is actually, it seems to me, supported by the data, but not perfectly. Okay, so let's look at other cases where this has been done. So let's talk about influenza and the flu vaccine, where I discovered another example of this. So astonishingly, and I have other videos and articles on this, prior to COVID, so prior to 2020, the Centers for Disease Control, the government, they had 3 different sets of numbers of the number of deaths attributed to influenza or the flu, the so-called flu. Now understand that influenza is a particular type of virus. Probably with COVID, a lot of people understand this now, but influenza is a specific type of virus. However, both the term influenza historically and flu are often used kind of generically to refer to, any kind of respiratory illness that you normally get during the winter. Okay, so they have these three numbers and two of them differed by a factor of 3. So one is about 50,000 deaths per year, about 2% of deaths per year is attributed in the leading causes of death report to influenza and pneumonia. Now, this is another trick because influenza is actually only tested for in a small subset of people who die of respiratory illnesses or in part from respiratory illnesses. Okay, so 2% leading causes of death and about 6% of deaths, or about 180,000 people per year, in something called FluView, which is now PIC, pneumonia, influenza, and COVID. So depending on how much you follow what's been going on with COVID, you may very well have been to the FluView website, and they've merged influenza, pneumonia, and COVID into this murky category. So what were they doing? Well, that's not actually clear. They've never clarified this. I asked them to clarify this, and I never got a straight answer. They never denied the explanation that I came up with as to why this huge difference in these numbers. The likely reason in the fine print is the leading causes of death, pneumonia or influenza, is listed on the death certificate pre-COVID as what's called the underlying cause of death. And if you look at all death certificates, at least in the CDC numbers, you also have death certificates frequently where influenza or pneumonia is listed as what's called a contributing factor or a cause of death. It's not the underlying cause of death. Why is this? Well, death is actually complex, and figuring out what the cause of death is often difficult. Most people are old and frail when they die. They have cancer, they have heart problems, they have all kinds of things going wrong with them at the same time. So it's not always clear what the cause of death is. You're much more susceptible to being killed by respiratory illnesses and probably other things when you're old and frail and your health is failing than is normal. It's the same thing we've seen with COVID. This is the way respiratory illnesses work. They finish off people who are in bad shape. Now, in COVID, for example, and we'll talk about before COVID with influenza, the government, the CDC, and these agencies and the vaccine companies kind of misled people about the risks, trying to create the impression that this is influenza is a dangerous virus and it can kill, and it probably does occasionally kill perfectly healthy people, have nothing wrong with it. But mostly it's taking out people, young or old, who have some other things wrong with them. Right. So broadening the definition and saying that it had anything to do with the death makes the numbers much larger. Why would you do that? Well, remember, how do we sell things? We sell a problem, the flu, and we sell a solution, which is either the flu vaccines or in a few cases, special drugs like Tamiflu. But you got to convince people it's really something to worry about. 6% of pop deaths, a lot bigger than 2%. And that appears to be what they did. They used a broad definition. And the other thing that they did, which is not exactly a horror story, but what they did, just as it appears to have been done with COVID, is really to exaggerate and confuse the risks. In other words, your risk as a healthy 40-year-old or a healthy 25-year-old from influenza is much lower. You're healthy, you're fine, and it's very rare, perhaps impossible, extremely rare to die from influenza alone. Now, you could be in a car accident, you're in intensive care, you're in pretty bad shape after some kind of accident or something happens as a young person, then you're much more susceptible to influenza or probably any of these things, any virus, coronaviruses before COVID, or I forget, RSV, whatever that is, syncytial virus, these kind of things. Why? Because you're in really bad shape. Your immune system is not working very well. Your body is struggling to deal with something else that's undermining it. So this is the same trick. You have a broad definition, like 1 million missing children, and then you sell something. Bigger budget for the FBI, for example, was part of this, almost certainly. I mean, there's a much longer story about how the FBI used various statistical tricks to exaggerate the risk of serial killers and these other things and get bigger budgets for the FBI generally and for the behavioral sciences unit, this high-profile unit that specialized in serial killers. So that's the point. You use a broad definition, you get a big number, 6% of people are dying from influenza, and then you sell something, public policies, drugs, vaccines, etc. That's the technique. This is the old way of doing things. And you could do this pre-computer, right? You don't have to have computers to do this. It's pretty simple, right? It's just simple counting of numbers. And what you do is you use this broad definition and you pair it with something frightening, people dying, abductions and murders. And mostly the emotion of the stories, which are heavily repeated, is really what hooks you and sells you. But without science, statistics backing it up, of course, people are going to say, well, it's like man bites dog, right? It's in the news, but it's not a big problem, right? So you have to have the scientific backing, the statistical backing that claims the problem is very large. But it can be easily debunked, as happened with the missing children. The million missing children number was easily debunked because you poke through it and you realize, oh, they're counting these broadly defined cases. Some teenage girl goes off and makes out with her boyfriend or something. That's not what people are really, really worried about. Of course, some parents are worried about that, but in terms of the real risk, murder and so forth, it isn't a big deal. So what do we have now that's new and different, that's really broadened? We have, in my opinion, at least two new tactics that were rare without computer technology. And those are what I call data laundering, which is kind of a data science equivalent of money laundering. And the other one is mathematical models, which I don't know if they have an exact analogy in financial fraud, although in fact mathematical models have been used in, for example, the 2008 financial crisis, the mortgage-backed securities that were involved. All of this stuff involved very sophisticated mathematical models that really hid the risk of these investments, disguised it in a lot of Gaussian this and all this mathematical and statistical jargon, but they were actually doing something fairly simple, which is taking risky loans and repackaging them as AAA securities. But they had this mathematical smokescreen to hide what they were doing. Let's talk about what I mean by data laundering, because that's actually probably less familiar to the audience. In money laundering, if you look into financial fraud cases or the mafia or things like that, what goes on in money laundering? A lot of small transactions. You want to launder $1 billion in drug money. You don't just, bring in $1 billion in cash from your drug dealers and make that, appear. It's done in little increments. It's hidden as normal small transactions. So you get some business that has large cash receipts, which historically is entertainment is a good one for that. Movie theaters, record stores. That's one of the reasons that the organized crime people turn up in entertainment. I mean, there are other reasons. Entertainment is often overlaps with selling drugs and prostitution and other things. And the point is, you need a business that has a lot of cash receipts. Historically, a lot of entertainment activities, they're not the only example, but a grocery store has large cash receipts. So you get control of a business, or you hook up with some business and you say, I got some cash. You get a few percent of the cash and you make it appear. You set up some financial transactions, but they're always small. Remember, the government, if it is looking for this stuff, is looking for big transactions. They want a report of, somebody deposited $100,000 in cash in one transaction. So you don't do that. You do a lot of little transactions. Even if you find one, it's under the size limit for something really seriously illegal. Somebody gets slapped on the wrist. Maybe they're in jail for a little while, but basically you get away with it. So the goal is a lot of small transactions to produce making this money appear. So you're a brilliant businessman. Your milk store chain in Cincinnati, for example, somehow turned into this giant multi-billion-dollar business, and you're buying out anybody and you're doing all these things. Okay, something like that. Or it could be grocery chains in Boston or New York or wherever, right? And there are cases of this being documented. Like there's a big scandal with the Bank of Boston and this, I think, chain of grocery stores in Boston back in the 80s that were run by organized crime type people. Okay, so this is how it's done with money, right? Little amounts, large number of transactions, very confusing often. Lots of shell companies, it's like three card Monte, the street con, right? It's very complicated. You can't figure out what's going on. The data equivalent is to make a lot of small mistakes, or you broaden the definition. Instead of one big redefinition like missing children or suddenly, teenage girls running away for 2 hours or something, right? Or again, you start saying that a contributing factor to a death is the underlying cause of death. You do a giant redefinition. That's much easier for third parties like me or you to find. That's one of the drawbacks. A lot of the techniques in How to Lie with Statistics, the Darrell Huff book, are actually pretty simple. And if you know what to look for, you can figure them out and say, oh, that's what they did, right? They did this one simple change. They made a big thing, created a problem that really doesn't exist or was grossly exaggerated. But with data laundering, you make a lot of little mistakes, little changes, and they add up to a big effect. And that's much harder to prove that it's happened, because you have to sit there and go, okay, well, they redefined this, they did this up here, they did a lot of little mistakes, which strangely enough all add up in one direction, or mostly add up in one direction. If it's really sophisticated, they'll make a couple of mistakes in the direction they don't want, so they can say, look, it's not all, mostly, right? And so that's how data laundering works. And that's pretty difficult to do with pencil and paper. I'm sure it's been done, but today we have computer systems, you have huge spreadsheets and data centers with supercomputers in them, essentially. I mean, some of them may have the computing power of the human brain, that kind of thing. They can actually do this. And it's probably in many cases now automated with, or partially automated with software. So you can create an illusion, which is very difficult for, let's say, the average person anyway, or even an expert, to pull out and show that it's being done. Not only do you have to go through step by step each of these manipulations of each data category, so it's all over the place, and you have to somehow show to a third party, to the public, or okay, they're doing all these questionable things, and they're not as big as the redefinitions from the past. They're just a little, I think it's 10% bigger than it should be, which is harder to discredit, right? It's like, okay, well, they happen to think this effect is a little bit bigger, right? So they're able to create a large signal out of a lot of little small signals that have been tweaked, and quote, a big problem, which you should then run out and fear. There's lots of indications of this in both COVID statistics and even other things. And in other words, we see a lot of these mistakes like, oh, let's take these sick people and put them back in a nursing home while they have COVID or something, and then they get the other people. It's a mistake, but it happens to boost the number of dead people, encouraging the use of intubation, for example, which is a very dangerous procedure. I mean, some doctors, at least privately, they will tell you they don't do it, right? That it's so dangerous that they just don't think it's worth doing. And you have other things like you discourage using steroids, which historically have been used when people have a really bad respiratory infection. That's what happened to me back in 2013. I had an unusually bad respiratory infection. I went to the hospital. One of the things they did is gave me steroids. They didn't know what I had. They never tested me for influenza or any of these other things. It's just that often it appears that there's an immune overreaction and the steroids suppress that, or something like that. I mean, I'm not a doctor, so don't treat what I just said as medical advice or anything like that. It's not. It's just to illustrate that steroids have been used to treat respiratory problems for some time, but their use was actually discouraged during COVID initially, especially, but probably still. It's hard to know. So you find these things where they're like discouraging traditional treatments for respiratory illnesses where you don't know what it is. And in most cases, they don't, go to the hospital and you have an unusually bad respiratory illness. As far as I know, they generally don't test what you have. They just follow certain protocols. They give you antibiotics because maybe it's a bacteria, or there's a theory that the viral diseases cause, they damage you in some way. So then you get a bacterial infection. There's all this fuzzy stuff in respiratory illnesses. It's not a very precise science when you really look at it. So you have a series of mistakes or value judgments or whatever in this data analysis, and somehow it produces a big number. That's data laundering. It's very much like money laundering. We use a lot of small transactions to hide that you're making, millions or billions of dollars from drug dealing. Something like that went on with HSBC Bank, which was taking cash from these, gangsters in Mexico, things like that. So it's a data equivalent of money laundering. The other one you see frequently now are mathematical models, because now, my laptop is more powerful than the mainframe computer that I used in the 1980s. Everybody, your cell phone is a supercomputer by historical standards. So it's very easy now for people to create mathematical models, which are often very complex. It's all dressed up in Gaussians and Gompertz functions and all this complex stuff, which you'll see a little references to on my website. All this complicated mathematical analysis, which can be potentially powerful, and in some cases historically has really been very powerful in physics or some other fields. You see this mathematical architecture implemented in programming languages like Python or R or C++, all this complex technical stuff. Outcomes, the world is ending, like with the mathematical model from Mel Ferguson of COVID that played a major role in the panic in March of 2020. Actually, from many accounts, it took a very high infection fatality rate for COVID underneath the covers. Or underneath the front. They were doing something fairly simple that was questionable. But mathematical models provide it looks really advanced. You have these guys with PhDs, just like happened in 2008 with the financial crash, where all of this was cloaked in these sophisticated mathematical models, which were improperly, applied. And that's been going on for a long time in derivative securities. So I think I can explain the basic trick that's been done historically with these models. There's something called the bell curve, which you probably saw in high school or something. It looks kind of like a bell. And this describes the distribution of a lot of errors in the real world. There's a whole scientific or statistical theory why that is. But one of the characteristics of it is as you move away from the peak, it drops off very sharply, exponentially. So it gets very close to zero after a few sort of what are called standard deviations, widths, if you will, of the distribution. It has what are called thin tails or no tails. So the probability of, for example, a financial crash, which is a big leap, right, is actually very low according to the bell curve. Financial investments, assets, stocks, all that kind of stuff doesn't follow the bell curve. Okay, it follows some kind of other distribution, which has these long tails. So even though most of the time the changes in the price of the stock are pretty small, like an average, every once in a while you get this huge leap. And the probability of that huge leap in reality is much higher than what you get from using the bell curve as your model. So lots of derivative models, like I forget the name, the option pricing model that was very popular. Black-Scholes is the name that they use for it, after Fisher-Black and Myron Scholes. So the Black-Scholes option pricing model is built on the assumption of a bell curve. So from the very beginning, back in the 70s, when they started doing option trading and so forth, at that time, there had been options before, but from the very beginning, they were assuming a distribution of, the changes in prices and returns. It's a financial buzzword. They were assuming something that actually was generally not true with financial assets. So again, you have all this mathematical stuff that is most people don't know that much about these things. You should. The understanding of these issues is critical in the modern world, especially with computers. We're seeing more and more the data laundering and the mathematical model cloaking, if you will, to hide tricks that are, kind of modern, more sophisticated versions of what Darrell Huff and How to Lie with Statistics was talking about. So your options are try to learn how to do it yourself, hire an expert like me to go through what you're seeing, or some kind of automation, which is what I'm working on at my company, is to automate a lot of these analyses and detecting things like data laundering or models that really aren't right. It's a difficult problem, I should say. It's not something we know fully how to do. And although I've made some progress, I don't know how to do it fully either. So in conclusion, understand that there are now sophisticated ways using computers to lie with statistics. And these are, at least two of them, are data laundering and sort of mathematical model cloaking of some manipulation or something. This super complex math is hiding, in some cases, a very simple manipulation, like inserting a different infection fatality rate into your model. But in many cases, like the data laundering, it's been spread out throughout the model through many terms, many components of the model. So you can't even figure out what's being done to manipulate you. But remember, there are these new methods that are becoming more and more widespread, backed up by the government, follow the science, and they're very hard to find and realize that it's happening. And what are they doing? In many, many cases, they try to create a big problem in your mind, scare you, and then sell you a solution you don't need, or that may even be extremely dangerous. New and improved methods to lie with statistics.
This concludes this video presentation. If you like this video, please click like. Please click subscribe and the notification bell if you would like to receive more content from us. You can avoid internet censorship by subscribing directly to our RSS news feed. Please consider sharing the link by email and on your website or blog, in addition to liking, upvoting, or sharing on increasingly censored, advertising beholden, big company social media. We have encountered such censorship. Mathematical software is developing algorithms and software to automate data analysis, reducing the risks of costly errors and increasing the predictive power of the results. You can support our work financially by subscribing on our Patreon page, https://www.patreon.com/mathsoft, or scanning the QR code in the lower right corner.